Hi, it's time for this week's Sunday sit-down chat on July. We're in July 22nd. So today I'm going to talk about my top 10 favorite worker placement games. And I'm doing this partially to talk about game design, to talk about the game design of these elements, partially to talk about a mechanism I love. It's one of my top 3 favorite game mechanisms, period. Worker placement, engine building, and I cut you choose, or I price you choose, either one. I love worker placement, and one of the reasons I love it is I like in games when there's a clear visual and tactile way of showing that you are taking an action or doing a turn. Whatever you need to do in the game, I like when there's a clear way the game shows you how to do it. There's no action menu, no action checklist. The board is visually showing you the actions that you have to choose. With worker placement, I also like that often there are interactions that stem from that. My definition of worker placement is a game in which players are placing workers in a common area. There doesn't necessarily need to be interactions, but this is distinctly different, in my opinion, than when you're placing workers or tokens on your own tableau or your own player mat. Like Scythe, for example. Scythe, in my opinion, is not a worker placement game because the places where you are placing your action token is private to you. It's a private mat. It cannot be where other players cannot choose those actions that you have. And this came to mind when I was looking at this list. Orleans is a game that I love. And I saw in BGG that it is listed as a worker placement game. I would not classify Orleans as a worker placement game because you are placing workers in your own private area. There's only one place in the game where you're almost displacing workers in a common area, but that's not like an action selection area. So as much as I love Orleans, I wouldn't put it on this list. I would not consider it a worker placement game. There are maybe one or two games on my list where that they toe the line a little bit, but I'll get to that in a minute. You can also probably tell that I love worker placement because many of the games that I've designed are worker placement. Viticulture is, Euphoria is, Charterstone is. These are all games where you're placing workers on a common area that other players can place workers on or influence. So I, in general, as a designer, I really like this mechanism. And again, I want to emphasize that this is my list. This is not necessarily the list that I'm saying I think you should play those games, where I think these are the best worker placement games of all time. These are just of the games that I have played. These are my favorites. These are the ones that I am most likely to continue to play. Although really, I'm willing to try any worker placement game. And the things that I'll focus on when I talk about these games are worker placement specifically. So I'm not going to talk about, like, there's a game on this list that is a wonderful engine building game. I'm not going to focus on that. I'm going to focus on the thing that I love about worker placement in that game. And some of them just happen to be games that have worker placement that are games that I love. So number 10 is Stone Age. Stone Age is a classic worker placement game. I don't have it on my shelf currently because I gave it to a family member, and I figured I'd get another copy someday when I wanted to return to it. I've played Stone Age quite a bit. And the worker placement in Stone Age is a little bit unique compared to many of the other games on this list because on your turn, you are choosing one area of the board. Well, there are areas of the board where you're collecting resources, and then there are other areas that are very specific. There are things like moving up the food track or making a new worker, and there's one other one, getting the tools. So those are all very specific spots where you're putting either one or two workers there to take an action, but you don't take the action right away. The other spots are resource gathering areas, and you're putting a number of workers in those areas. But you can only choose each area once. So if I want to gather wood, for example, I need to choose right away how many workers I want to gather wood, and I need to put all those workers there right away. If I can't put one worker there and then return to put more there later. So it's kind of an all or nothing endeavor each round. And in Stone Age, you are putting out those workers and not doing anything with them, and then on your turn, you are retrieving the workers and activating their abilities. So I thought that this is for better or worse for the flow of the game, because it's intuitive now, I think, in terms of modern games, to place the worker and do the action right away. I think that's fairly intuitive. And I think it kind of interrupts the flow of the game to be placing and then have a separate phase for retrieving and activating. But at the same time, it actually makes Stone Age pretty easy to teach because you don't have to really explain all that. Like, the game is super simple as to what you're explaining. You're just saying, okay, you're gathering resources. put the workers there, and that'll show you how many resources you're going to gather. So I think there's a give and take there for Stone Age. But overall, I enjoy playing it as a worker placement game. Number 9 is Belfort. Belfort's another one that I used to have on my shelf, and I have no idea what happened to it. I think I lent it to a friend, and I don't know who has it, and it just hasn't come back. But Belfort is largely really an area majority game, even within the worker placement, but I think this is what makes the worker placement really interesting. You are placing workers, and Belfort's one of the first games that I'm aware of that has specific workers that do specific things. I can't remember all the details at this point, but there are like certain workers that you can use to gather stone, and other workers won't gather stone for you. You can't use them to gather stone. And when you gather stone, for example, I put, and I hope I say this correctly because it really has been a while since I played Belfort, but basically majority matters. So if I put out like 4 workers to gather stone and another player puts out 2, I think if I remember correctly, I get 4 stone, that other player gets 2 stone, but because I'm in the majority, I get a bonus. I think I get a +1 stone. And I like that there's that interaction with workers. Again, it's kind of like Stone Age, where you're putting out all the workers first and then you are activating them. But I like that it builds in that majority element. Then it actually makes a little bit more sense why you're not activating them right away in Belfort. Belfort has a lot of other interesting interactions, but I like those 2 elements. Different workers doing different things, and area majority when you're actually collecting the resources based on how many workers you put there. Number 8 is Tribune. Tribune is a Roman-themed game that's largely card-driven, but worker placement is a big part of how you select those cards. So there's all these kind of mini games going on Tribune, and you are placing workers to show how you're going to interact with those mini games. And really, it's the mini games that make the game shine, like just the way the different cards work. You can look into how the game works if you want to learn more about it in detail. But I actually don't have a ton to say about the worker placement in general. It's a nice worker placement game. It's the mini games that shine. The worker placement is just how you interact with those games, how you select cards, and what order you're selecting them. And I enjoy Tribune. Number 7 is Russian Railroads. This is a game that I really enjoy. It will definitely be on my top 10 engine building game list because it is mostly an engine building game. But it does have a strong worker placement element to it. That's a big part of the game where you're placing workers to get new tracks, to get new engineers, and there's some other worker placement spots as well. But I really like the way the worker placement spots work on gathering new tracks for the most part, because and new trains, because it's one of these areas where you can put one worker down. You can choose an action space and put one worker down there to gain say whatever the number of tracks is that you gain. I think it's like 1 to 2, or you can place 3 workers down, or maybe 2 workers down to gain 3 tracks. So the 1 to 2 ratio is better, but if you know for sure that you need 3 tracks, you might go ahead and put the 2 workers down, even though it costs more and the ratio is worse. So I like that there's a viable choice either way. So it's not distinctly worse to spend more workers in this game. It might actually at times be better to spend more workers right away rather than spending fewer workers. So I really like that in this game, that there are actions that cost fewer or more workers, but spending more workers isn't necessarily worse than spending fewer workers. Number 6 is Ora et Labora. This was a close one for this list, because in Ora et Labora, you are mostly using your own actions. In the village that you're building, this is a huge inspiration for Charterstone. You're building this village out of cards that are buildings that you can place workers on to activate them. But Ora et Labora does allow you to use workers in other players' areas using a specific set of rules, but it's generally available for you to do that. And so I like that element, that you can use what other players are building, but that you still have very much a huge sense of ownership over what you are building. And in Ora et Labora, there's a lot of actions where you can spend something X number of times to gain X number of things. So I could spend just 1 wood to get, what's the thing that you can get wood out of in this game? I think beer is whiskey. So I could spend 1 wood to get 1 whiskey, or I could spend 3 wood to get maybe 3 whiskey, or it might even be a multiplier. It might be 5 whiskey, it might be more. So there's this really nice tension in the game of, do I wait to use the action until I've saved up a lot of those resources and I can maximize that action, or do I use it right away because I need that resource right away to get a new building or to use another action? I really like, I think Uwe Rosenberg does that in a number of his games, but I really like the tension that creates when an action has the potential, has different varying levels of potential based on when you use it and what you have when you use it. My number 5 is, a game that I finally can show you is Yedo. I really love Yedo. I keep returning to this game. This is probably the lowest ranked Board Game Geek game on this list. Belfort's pretty low too, but I love Yedo. There are certain elements that I don't enjoy about Yedo. It can be kind of a punishing game. I talked about this on the game exceptions list, where it can be a bit punishing. But the worker placement is so interesting in this game because the missions you are trying to fulfill, when you try to fulfill them, this is the core of the game, you're getting missions to gain money and victory points and sometimes other stuff too. And it's really satisfying to fulfill these missions. But when you try to fulfill a mission, almost always you need a worker on a specific spot on the board that is thematically tied to the mission. So if you have like the Seduce a Geisha mission, you need to put a worker in the red light district because that's where the seduction takes place. And almost every mission is like this. You need, thematically tied to what the mission does, you need a worker in a specific place to do that mission. And so the places where you put workers aren't just relevant for what you're gathering, but also for these missions tied to the theme. I really, really like that. I don't think I've seen it done in another game. I actually tried to do this in one of the early builds of my Red Rising game because I love it so much, but I couldn't get it to work. If you can think of another game that does this, I'd love to hear about it in the comments because I really, really like that mechanism. Number 4 is what many people actually compare Yedo to, even though really they're very different games, but I think it's because of the missions you're trying to fulfill. And it is Lords of Waterdeep. Lords of Waterdeep, it's kind of like coming home. It's the feeling of comfort. It's very easy to play. It's very easy to introduce to new gamers, and it's one of those games where, other than during setup, there's a few little fiddly things. You really, once you know how to play it, you don't have to return to the rules at all. So I can return to Lords of Waterdeep after not playing for a year or so, and I'm fine just to sit down and play it. And also, there's a great app. I play Lords of Waterdeep more on the app than I do in cardboard form. What is my favorite thing about worker placement in Yedo? In Lords of Waterdeep, probably the buildings. I really like that you can each game the board starts off very simple. Actually, 2 things. One, the board starts off very simple, and the economy of the game is very clear through the game. It's clear that the white and purple resources are more scarce and thus more valuable than the orange and the black resources, because you can only get 1 white or 1 purple on an action, whereas you can get 2 orange or 2 black for the same 1 worker on those actions. So I like that the economy is very clear. And then I like that players can build additional buildings, adding new action spaces to what starts off as a very basic board. I like that it starts simple and grows in complexity throughout the game, and the actions grow there. And that the owners of the buildings get a little benefit when someone uses them. All those things tie together into a very satisfying worker placement game for me. Number 3 is another game that I have. This is a 2018 addition to the list, Rajas of the Ganges. I really, really love Rajas of the Ganges. It's definitely my favorite dice worker placement game. I'm sure others will have different opinions of that in the comments. Like Marco Polo is very good, but I would always choose Rajas over Marco Polo, in my opinion. What do I love about this game? I love so much, but about the worker placement, it does all these things that are just right about worker placement. Like there are lots of different action spots to choose, but they increase in cost. Some of them require a very specific die. Dice are the resource in this game. You're not placing dice, you're placing workers and you're spending dice. So I guess that it isn't really a dice worker placement game, but the dice are so involved, they're so integral to the game. But so there are some actions that require specific dice colors, others that require specific dice numbers, others that don't care about the number. Let's see, I'm trying to think if there's anything very specific about the worker placement itself, like where you're placing the workers. I don't know, there's just a nice variety of actions based on those dice that I mentioned. Really, the other things that I love about this game are not related to the worker placement. It's like the tracks. I love how the tracks work in this game. But it's a very solid worker placement game that I really, really enjoy playing. Getting close to number one here. So number 2 is A Feast for Odin, which I believe has 61 different worker placement places where you can place workers. And what I really like about Feast for Odin is that it takes that sheer number of worker placement spots, and it helps you hone in on certain things based on the number of workers that you have, because there are 4 columns. There's one column where you need to spend 1 worker in that column. Second column is 2. Third column is 3. Fourth column, you need to spend 4 workers to take those actions, but they're super powerful. So there's so many interesting choices in this game based on how many workers you have at any given time, the things that you have. But I really like that it takes all these actions. It throws 61 actions at you. But at certain points in the game, like I may only have 4 workers. So I need to decide, do I want to spend all 4 workers on a really powerful action right now? Or do I want to spend fewer of them, kind of stretch out those workers on weaker actions? It doesn't even really help delineate those actions all that much. There's always, because you always have so many different choices to choose from. But for some reason, that column system really works. I don't even know why. It just, I guess it's just a good reminder. Like, if you're going to make a game with a lot of action choices, perhaps consider breaking them down by number of workers, because I think that does help players decide what's important to them at any given time in the game. My number 1 worker placement game, you probably know it if you followed my blog, is Tzolk'in. I love Tzolk'in. I absolutely love this game. I continue to return to it. And part of it is that it is an engine builder, and I love engine builders. But a big part of it is the way that you use time as a resource in the game, and that's tied to the workers. So on your turn, you are either placing any number of workers that you have available, or you are retrieving a number of workers that you have available, and you are gaining the benefits from them. You're paying a cost when you place them, really 2 levels of cost, and you are pretty much only gaining a benefit when you retrieve them. There are a few actions that require a cost then, but for the most part, you're just gaining a benefit. But time is used in this game because these workers are all on gears. You're placing them on gears, and those gears are turning every round. And so the choice in this game is how long do you leave your workers on those gears, because the benefits get better the longer those workers are on the gears. So there's a wonderful tension there and a wonderful decision space as to how many workers to place, because it costs a lot to place more and more workers, and also how long to leave those workers on the gears. The game flows really well. I like on your turn that you're only retrieving or placing, and that you are in charge of that. It's not the game telling you, hey, everybody, now is the time to retrieve workers. That you decide when to place, when to retrieve, which contributes to a really nice flow of the game. So the flow and the using time as a resource for your workers is just wonderful in this game. And I'm still waiting for another game to do it that well, to use time as a resource as well as Tzolk'in does it. I think that's it. Those are my top 10 worker placement games, along with why I really like the worker placement elements in each of these games. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this list. I'd love to hear your list, if you can think of your top 10 worker placement games. If you go to Board Game Geek and select Advanced Search, and then choose the mechanism worker placement, that might help you sort through all the various worker placement games that are out there. If you have a different definition of worker placement, I'm open to hearing that in the comments. And obviously, I did not put any of my games on this list. I don't like to put my games on these top 10 lists, as much as I love to play Euphoria and Viticulture and Charterstone. They were not eligible for this list. You're welcome to put them on yours if they are truly one of your favorites. If not, I won't be offended. Put anything on your list. I'm open to hearing it, and I'd love to hear, maybe there'll be some recommendations of games that I have not played, because really I am willing to try and play any worker placement game. I really, really love this mechanism. That's it for Sunday Sit Down. Have a good week. I'll see you next week.